So moving on, and okay, I'm going to talk, if I can make the slide work, we're going to talk about project finance and what is project finance, which is a subject which I think is probably familiar to many of you. The key thing is that it's a specialized kind of finance. It's not how do you finance projects. It's a particular type of long-term financing, which is used for high-cost assets with a long construction and operating period. And the lenders are relying primarily on project contracts and not physical assets as the security. There is another book on project finance, which of course is not as good as my book, but it has a very good subtitle. It's called Project Finance, Contract-Based Financial Engineering. And I think that is actually the way I would describe project finance as well. I think it's rather a nice phrase. So the repayment is from the cash flow, which means that the cash flow has to be isolated, which is why you need to have a project company which is only doing the project. The investors in the project typically are not guaranteeing the lenders. And there's a high ratio of debt to equity. Why is that a good thing? Because basically debt is cheaper than equity, therefore it reduces the overall cost of the project. Both in the context of PPP, that means it makes it cheaper for the public sector too. The other thing which is different is that there's a finite project life. In other words, the debt has to be repaid in full. Whereas if you're a company, of course, the company never repays all of its debt. It just keeps reborrowing and rolling over. Whereas you have a PPP that lasts for 30 years, you know at the end of 30 years, all the debt has got to be paid off because there's nothing left to pay the debt off after that. So the sort of industries that are using project finance is in a sense fairly obvious. I mean, it actually began really in the natural resources industry. And in fact, again, a slight diversion, but I was reading a history of the oil industry some time ago, and the earliest example of what I would call modern project finance that I found was actually in the Russian Empire, in the oil fields in Baku, when Crédit Lyonnais, the French bank, was actually lending to owners of oil fields in Baku based on the oil in the ground. In other words, the cash flow the oil was going to produce was sufficient to provide security for the bank, and that was in the year 1906, I think it was. So as you can see, there's nothing new in this world. And of course, it's still the case that project finance is used in the natural resources sector, and indeed it's been used in this way in a very big way within the Russian natural resources sector. But primarily, I'm talking about other types of infrastructure in this context. And I think in that context, it's fairly obvious what industries we're talking about, and they're similar to those we've already been talking about. Okay, so this is a diagram that many of you will have seen. As you may know, it's known as the spider diagram for a fairly obvious reason if you look at it, I think. And what you have in this diagram, you have, I won't try and, is this going to work? I'm not sure. Does that work? No, it's not going to work on there, I don't think. Look, you have the project company in the middle. And the project company has signed, for example, in this case, it's a toll road, it's signed a concession agreement with a public authority. And the road users are paying on the left, they're paying their tolls. You see the project financing, which is being provided by a combination of equity investment by, I'm still having a problem with this microphone. Equity investment provided by shareholders in the company, and debt provided by lenders. You'll also see that there may be a direct agreement, as there typically is in Russian concessions, between the project company and the lenders relating to paying back the debt. I'll come back to that point later on. Now, the other important thing I mentioned, this issue of passing risk on to subcontractors, and you'll see that there's a box at the bottom with a dotted line around it. And you'll see the project company has signed a series of subcontracts. It's signed a construction subcontract, a toll operating subcontract, and an operating and maintenance contract with private sector contractors. And by doing that, and by the obligations that these subcontractors have taken on, it's passed the risk down to these contractors. So that from the lender's point of view, they know that the construction risk is being taken not by a project company that has no other assets, but by a large construction company. Now, obviously, this has a cost. The construction company will charge more for undertaking this sort of turnkey contract than it does for undertaking a normal construction contract where it's not taking these risks of delivering on time, within costs and within budget. But so you're paying for that extra security. So equity and debt, typically the equity provided by investors. Who are the investors? They may be construction companies. They may be insurance companies or people who are looking for long-term, fairly safe cash flow investments, or pension funds who also have the same approach. Infrastructure investment funds, which are found very widely around the world now. And the government itself may, in fact, be an investor in projects. Typically, they're providing something between 10 and 20% of the capital cost of the project. Now, investors are taking a high risk, and they're getting a high return for that risk. I think typically, in the Russian context, they're getting something like 15% return, which sounds a lot, but of course, if the project goes wrong, they're not going to be getting 15%. They may end up with 0 or a minus number. So they have what financiers would describe as upside and downside. They can do well or they can do badly. On the other hand, you have lenders who are providing typically the rest of the debt. I mean, there may be some public sector contribution that we'll come back to, but the lenders are providing the rest of the capital costs, sorry, not the debt. They're getting a fixed return, and clearly, in relation to that, they want a low risk because they don't have any upside. If things go well, they don't earn more money. But if things go badly, they lose money. So it's clear the lenders are the conservative people as far as risk is concerned. In fact, it's the lenders who determine the risk. There's a well-known saying that's attributed to Mark Twain, although nobody can find where Mark Twain actually said it, which is that a banker is a man who lends you an umbrella when it's not raining, because the banker doesn't want to take any risk, in other words. So there you go. So if we look internationally, who are the big players? Well, you'll see that they're very confined to certain countries these days. The Japanese are actually, as far as the commercial banking sector is concerned, they are the largest players, including my old employer, MUFJ, which is Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi, it used to be called. I actually started up their project finance department many, many years ago when they were a lot smaller in this business than they are today. So the Japanese and the French and one Spanish bank, Santander. Then you have supposedly a commercial bank, State Bank of India. By the way, these statistics are based on a journal called Project Finance International. This is where these numbers come from. And State Bank of India is technically a private company, but actually the majority of its equity is owned by the state. I mean, it's rather like Gazprom as far as that's concerned. So do you really call that a private sector bank? I'm not so sure. So, and certainly the same thing applies to Bank of China down the bottom. Otherwise, a bit lower down the list, you'll see some British banks, you'll see some German banks, you'll see some Canadian banks, Italians. Surprisingly, what you won't see is very much is American banks. American banks are not big players in the project finance market because they typically don't like lending money long term. So here, in a similar sort of analysis to the one that you saw on PPPs, this is the sectors in which debt is being provided in the project finance market. And you'll see that there are really three big kind of legs of this market. The power sector, primarily power generation, and of course, in recent years, it's renewables in wind and solar power, where there have been huge investments and where a huge proportion of this, including in Russia, is being financed by project finance. Then you have infrastructure, which is basically the PPP sector, both concessions and availability PPPs. Transportation is a large share of that. Natural resources, of course, tends to go up and down with natural resources prices. So if you went back a few years from this, you'd find actually a lot more money going into natural resources. And then you have a kind of miscellaneous sectors. You see things like, for example, stadiums in the United States, sports stadiums. The way this works in project financing terms is that companies agree to buy boxes in the stadium for so many years in advance, and they agree to pay rent for this. Now, this rent is a cash flow. So you can use this cash flow to raise money to build the stadium. That's project finance. Another example that I was involved in when I was in banking was making plastic bottles for Pepsi Cola. There was a factory which bought the materials, the plastic materials. They processed this into Pepsi Cola bottles. Pepsi Cola agreed to buy the bottles over a period of a number of years. So again, the factory was able to raise project finance based on the contract with Pepsi Cola. So obviously, we're using project finance in PPPs, but it doesn't have to be used only in relation to public sector projects. It also could be used in private sector projects. And in the power sector, where power is privatized, as it is in many countries around the world these days, project finance is still used for private sector projects in that way too. Then again, by region, well, despite the fact that American banks are not extensively involved in project finance, the fact is that the American market is by far the largest market for project finance. They invented it originally. Modern project finance dates back to the power sector in the United States in the 1980s, when a change in law made project financing attractive. Canada is also quite a big player there. And a number of the South American countries too, but the United States is overwhelmingly a major player there. Asia Pacific is a very large market. Both obviously the Japanese banks, the Chinese, and a number of the large local banks in countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and so forth do a lot. If we look at Europe and former Soviet Union, a pretty somewhat static market. As you saw also in relation to PPPs. The British market has been the largest most years, still is, mainly in renewables and things like the rail sector in franchises that I mentioned. Not particularly in PPPs now. The PPP side has faded away in the UK. France is a large player, including in PPPs, and Germany. Russian Federation, looking at those numbers, 2018, I think, was mainly the Moscow Central Ring Road, which I think was a large part of that. And that big number in 2016 was the Yamal LNG project, a natural resources project. You see the rest of the world. Middle East is, considering it's particularly the Gulf countries, although they're quite small countries, they do a lot of project finance in relation to oil and gas development, and also in relation to things like desalination plants. Sub-Saharan Africa, very little, a lot of talk and not a lot happening in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, apart from bank lending, you've also got the bond market, which I think also you have to a certain extent in the Russian market as well. This is where lenders are buying bonds in project, lenders who are typically non-banks, and which are done basically on much the same way as a bank financing. And the picture you see in terms of distribution between sectors is, yeah, so I mean the sector, well, the sectors are very similar to the banking markets. I won't actually say any more than that. What's interesting in the bond market is that it's concentrated in particular countries, of which the United States is again by far the largest. The bond market in the United States is enormous, not just in project finance, but generally. It's an enormous market. Otherwise, there are just certain countries which tend to have a reasonably active bond market. Britain being one of them, Australia, which is what you see in Asia Pacific there being another, and countries like France and Germany kind of come and go, and not much elsewhere in the world. And then the other source of project finance is, in effect, the public sector sources. And these really divide into two categories. On the one hand, you've got multilateral development finance institutions. People like the World Bank, Eurasia Development Bank in the Russian context, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, which actually isn't on there. These, although they do all kinds of lending, they do also do project finance, either in terms of making loans or guarantees for project finance. And then the other area of, if you like, public sector finance is export credit agencies and bilateral development finance institutions, of whom the big players there are Japan, Korea, and China. They provide large amounts of finance on a project financing basis. They do other kinds of finance as well, but this is on a project financing basis. Again, these statistics are collected by Project Finance International. So you've got particularly where raising finance is difficult from the domestic market, be it the bond market or the bank market, very often these international financial institutions can step in and fill that gap. So what is it that makes project finance debt a secure thing? From a banking point of view, it might seem in one sense quite insecure. You're lending money to build this project from nothing. You're lending money for 30 years. It all seems a bit crazy, really, if one thinks about it. But the key thing is, first of all, very extensive due diligence. The banks use external advisors. They use technical advisors. They use insurance advisors, for example, to ensure that they really understand or do their best to understand the risks of this project. I was very rude about bank technical advisors earlier on, but nonetheless, that's all they have, so they have to make use of those. And then they also do a lot of financial modeling. I mean, someone was asking during the break about financial modeling. It's so important. You need to do financial modeling to cover the whole of the project. And then if you're the lender, you're going to say, well, what happens if the construction cost does overrun? How is that going to affect the finances? Or what happens if operating costs are 10% higher? How does that affect the finances? What's the break even for this project in terms of revenue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? All of those things will be run again and again by the banks or the lenders who are putting this sort of project together. Then they control the cash flow very carefully. They don't just give the money to the project company. They control where every penny is being spent, and when every penny comes in, it's under their control too. And they make sure it's being spent in the right way. And they don't allow the shareholders to get any money until they're really sure that there's enough money to pay for everything else. Which means, amongst other things, they put money in reserve accounts where money is set aside. For example, they'll keep 6 months loan installments in a separate account all the time to make sure that their loan can always get paid, at least in the short term. They also get very detailed reporting on what's going on from the project company. They don't just wait for the published annual report. During the construction, they will get at least monthly reports. And their technical advisors will attend the site meetings to make sure he knows exactly what's going on. He gets all the paperwork to make sure that he knows what's going on. Then finally, they have the right to step in and take over the project company. There are rights of that nature in the Russian law. I have to say they're a bit vague again. It's not quite clear how it's done or what happens. But anyway, that right exists. So the result is actually that a well-managed project finance debt portfolio has very low losses. I mean, I was told by one very major Japanese bank that during the financial crisis, or as a result of the financial crisis, they had zero losses on their project finance portfolio. And they were a very big lender in the market, which I think that experience would not be uncommon, that losses are extremely small. So actually, for commercial banks, this business generally is safer than lending to companies and lending to individuals, which in terms of losses, which may sound quite strange, but that's the actual experience by banks. And in fact, the major credit rating agencies, people like Standard & Poor's, actually work with major international lenders in the project finance market, and they get given their data and confidentiality. And they produce reports every so often where they look at the level of default and the level of loss. And it's extremely small. So project financing is good stuff. So any of you who are here from banks and haven't come across this, you've got to start up, like I did many years ago, start up a project finance department. You can make money out of it. So there we go. So what's been happening in the international debt markets in the last few years? There have been some quite significant changes. I mean, what used to happen before the financial crisis in 07, 08 is that commercial banks would quite happily lend for 25 years or more to PPP projects, particularly in Europe and North America, and indeed in Asia, actually. In recent years, their appetite for this length of debt, and these are the banks whose names that you saw on that list, their appetite for this type of debt has dropped very considerably. They basically are really wanting to cut their debt term right back, periods of 7 years rather than 25 years, or maybe 12 years, or maybe if you're a really good client, maybe they might do 15 years for you. But they're very, very reluctant to go any longer than that. Why is that? As I said, they didn't make any losses during the financial crisis, so you think that was great. But what they did find was that they had a liquidity problem. What banks normally expect when they entered into these long-term project finance loans is that anytime they wanted to get rid of the loan, they could sell it to another bank in the market. That there was a market you could sell these things. And also that these loans would regularly get refinanced on better terms anyway. So although theoretically you were making a 25-year loan, actually after 7 years you get refinanced. So you weren't really making a 25-year loan. But that all fell apart in the financial crisis because suddenly there was no demand for these loans and loans didn't get refinanced. So suddenly this loan that they thought was actually quite liquid that they could sell any time, suddenly it wasn't liquid. And the result of that was that, amongst other things, the Basel Committee, which sets capital requirements for international banks, has in what's called the Basel IV, the fourth tranche of these capital requirements, has set some very stiff requirements for liquidity against long-term lending, which discourages long-term lending. So surprise, surprise, project financing suffers as a result. However, it doesn't mean project financing has gone away. As you saw from the statistics that I told you, project financing is still being done. Because what has come along to fill the gap is non-bank lenders. This is people who are not banks, who are not subject to these capital constraints. It's a bit of a paradox, really. And who are they? They are primarily insurance companies and pension funds, people who want long-term assets. The same people who invest in equity are also providing debt. Some of them lend directly if they have enough experienced staff to do this. Others invest in infrastructure debt funds. Now, infrastructure debt funds was something that hardly existed. Really, only 3 years ago, they hardly existed. They've now become quite important players in the market. I find, for example, where I'm dealing with waste projects in the UK, as I mentioned, I occasionally am dealing with banks, and I suddenly find, these aren't banks anymore. These are infrastructure funds who have now taken over this loan from banks. So you have completely new people involved in the market. So these are quite significant changes. Then another thing that's happened is the growth of so-called mini-perms. Now, this is an American term. In American real estate financing, what was typically done was that the banks would make a loan for a period of something like 5 years while the building was being built. And then it would get refinanced by what was called a permanent loan, a long-term loan from an insurance company. Now, what banks are doing in the project finance market is providing short-term loans, 5 to 7 years, to cover the construction period and a period shortly after that, on the assumption that they're going to get refinanced by a long-term loan, and hence this mini-perm, because it's not a kind of a permanent, long-term permanent loan, it's a short-term loan. There are two kinds of mini-perm. One is called a soft mini-perm. Now, in the soft mini-perm, what the banks do is they make a 25-year loan, but after 7 years, suddenly the interest rate increases enormously, and all the money that comes out of the cash flow, none of it goes to the shareholders anymore. It all has to go to making prepayments to the banks. And of course, the idea is to force the shareholders to refinance the debt if they can. If they can't, this is an unhappy situation for the shareholders, and indeed I've seen that on projects at the moment where the market is unattractive in some respects and people can't refinance. And so the shareholders lose out as a result. Or you have what's called a hard mini-perm, which is simply a 7-year loan. And then after 7 years, you fall off the end. The trouble with a 7-year loan, well, there are two problems. One is you may not be able to refinance it, and then what do you do? And secondly, that interest rates may have changed and gone up, and you've suddenly got a big interest rate risk. And this is actually what happened in Spain during the financial crisis. Spanish motorways concessions were being financed by Spanish banks based on 7-year loans. Suddenly you had the financial crisis. First thing that happens is the traffic drops because traffic is directly related to GDP. So suddenly the revenue from these projects drops very substantially, which doesn't exactly make them attractive for refinancing anyway. But besides which, the Spanish banks haven't got the resources to refinance because they're subject to a credit squeeze. And of course, interest rates have gone up. So what's the result? Bankruptcy of Spanish concessions. So there are problems there. If I look at the Russian project finance debt market, well, I'm not quite sure if it fully exists, but insofar as it does exist, it certainly seems to depend primarily on state or semi-state players. The name of Gazprom Bank seems to be particularly conspicuous. It would certainly be good to see the private sector banks in Russia getting more involved in project finance. I know some of the private sector banks have done some project financing in the renewable sector, for example. But I think there's a lot of scope for the private sector banks to get involved. And I think the advantage of private sector lenders is simply the question of due diligence. If private sector lenders are far more concerned to make sure this thing is going to work, public sector lenders or quasi-public sector lenders are far more likely to take decisions based on politics as well as finance. And the problem with decisions based on politics is that finance can overwhelm politics fairly easily when it comes to projects. So you end up with bad projects. And you look at other countries and there is a lot of experience of this. In India, they had a huge program of road PPPs. State Bank of India lent huge amounts of money for this. What happened? Of course, the projects all started going wrong because they were lent based on politics, not based on financial due diligence. Traffic projections all wrong, all this kind of thing. Construction costs understated, etc., etc. Result, huge amounts of bad loans on the books of State Bank of India. You can point to the same thing in Brazil, where Benedez, the state national economic development bank, did the same thing, huge losses. Mexico, same thing, huge losses. So it's really important to try and get the private sector private banking sector involved in project finance because they really do bring this kind of external professionalism to the table, which is very valuable. Yeah, one question that just happened, I was asked about, and I just put a short thing in, which is how do you as the public sector ensure that you've actually got competitive debt when you've been through a procurement process and the bank has been there, or you go to a bank and suddenly, how do you know they're quoting you the best terms? Well, the answer is if you have a competitive banking sector, and this is why you need the private sector involved, of course, this is you can go out and run a competition for the debt, and this is what's done in many European countries. Although actually a threat of competition may itself be sufficient to ensure that you don't need to have competition. Actually, the first job I did as a consultant, I was working for the sponsors of the first private sector power project in Tunisia. And a major French bank was our banker. But we did have the right to go out into the market and ask for competitive quotes. And all I did was I wrote an information memorandum, which I would leave casually lying on the table when we were talking to the French bank, and they said, "Oh, could we have a look at that?" I said, "Yeah, here you are." And they would look at this information memorandum. They could see it was all ready, that I could go out tomorrow to the banking market and ask for competitive quotes. I didn't need to, because that just ensured that the French bank remained competitive. So that's a question that can be dealt with, I think, fairly easily. So, moving on to talk about public sector support for PPPs, because we've been talking about PPPs and indeed project finance up to now as though the public sector, in a sense, doesn't have much to do. But actually, of course, the public sector tends to get quite involved in the financing side of this too. But the question is, first of all, why should the public sector get involved in providing any kind of support for PPP projects? So if we take the example of a toll road, should you actually try and pass the traffic risk of a toll road to the private sector? Yes, the private sector can employ traffic consultants, can try and work out what the traffic's going to be, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact is, first of all, that these sort of long-term projections are notoriously unreliable. The level of getting them wrong is extremely high. Why is that? One reason is simply data collection. Not enough data is collected for long enough to try and get this better. Not enough data is collected for long enough to try and ensure that you have enough long-term data and that you're dealing with short-term fluctuations. Then you have this question of so-called willingness to pay. People are not rational about toll roads. People will go a long way to avoid paying a relatively small toll, especially truck drivers who pay the highest tolls. So that although people, you can do assessments beforehand, and people say, yes, I'd pay a toll to save half an hour, I'd pay so much in a toll, but when the time comes, they don't. They actually just rather sit in a queue. So it's very difficult to work that out. It's the value of time saved. I mean, there are lots of, the traffic consultants have formulae for doing this, but the fact is that the formulae don't work. And then the other thing is in the public sector, who are the ones who produce the initial traffic projections, it actually makes sense to overestimate traffic because you want to build a road big enough for the most traffic that you expect. So the public sector will tend to start off from a high number, and inevitably the private sector will then tend to be influenced by this high number. And of course, within the public sector, it doesn't matter if you get the number wrong, because on the whole, if people get projections wrong in the public sector, they don't tend to suffer too much. Whereas in the private sector, of course, you will get the sack if you get your projections wrong. So, there's a different way of thinking as far as that's concerned. Then there's the further thing, which is known as the winner's curse, which is simply that people are bidding, they're bidding very aggressively. The people who are bidding, their Christmas bonus depends on winning this bid, so they will overbid. they will win, and then they'll wish that they hadn't actually won because they've actually bid too high. And that's the winner's curse. And that also causes, of course, obvious problems once the project moves forward. So, and the other thing is that the traffic growth is not really under the control of the project company. You know, what can the project company do to influence traffic growth? Not very much, except maybe make the tolls extremely cheap, but then that's probably not financially viable. Traffic growth is to do with the general growth in the economy, local development, the way in which the local and national transport network is being fitted together, which has nothing to do with this particular road. So the result of this is that the private sector is going to overprice for this risk. If it's going to be forced to take the risk, it's going to put a high price on doing it. So it's going to make it expensive. So you have to ask the question, well, in that case, why doesn't the public sector keep the risk itself rather than in some way, and we'll come back to that, rather than trying to transfer all the risk to the private sector? The other issue about transferring traffic risk to the private sector is that it can actually inhibit the way in which the public sector develops the network, because it's not uncommon to have what are called no-compete provisions. You build a road from A to B, and you do that as a concession. And then it's quite common to have in a concession an obligation by the public sector not to build another road which is going to compete with this road, a parallel road. Or if you do, you've got to provide compensation. And the problem then is that it inhibits the public sector's ability to develop its own network on a long-term basis. And one example of this was, I think, the first toll road in the United States, in California, where a road was built. And in the end, the state highway authority had to buy out the concession because there was a no-compete clause and they wanted to build other roads and they were stopped from doing this. So for all these reasons, transfer of risk, of traffic risk to the private sector is actually somewhat questionable. Though at first sight it may seem obvious, but it's actually somewhat questionable. Okay, so what sort of support can the private sector give to projects? Well, you can give a debt guarantee, which is what, as I understand it, is what you get in concessions in the Russian Federation. That's great, but for the lenders, but it means the lenders don't care. You know, they're not going to do any due diligence. Why should they spend any time examining the project if they have a guarantee? Now, speaking as a traditional banker, you shouldn't do this. The guarantee is your second way out, and you should make sure the first way out actually works. But in the real world, that's not quite how bankers behave. So if they have a guarantee, they're not going to spend a lot of time worrying about the project. So you're losing this due diligence. You're also, of course, taking on a large amount of risk in the public sector, which may well have to be reflected in the public accounts in some way, which you don't particularly want to do. So ideally, you want to move away from something simple like a debt guarantee. One approach is not to guarantee all the debt, to do what's called debt underpinning, where you guarantee part of the debt, and there are various ways in which you can do that. The French, for example, have a system called cession de crédit, which is not particular to PPPs. It comes under French administrative law. It means transfer of the loan. And what the French do is that once a project has been built and is operating, I think it's 75% of the debt, which is the bottom 75%. In other words, the first loss is still being taken by the private sector. 75% of that debt becomes an obligation of the state. It ceases to be an obligation of the project. The result of that, of course, is the cost of finance becomes much, much lower in that situation. It's not actually refinanced. That machinery is already there in the first place. So there's a very simple way of leaving risk with the private sector, but still cutting down costs by providing guarantees. Then, of course, and this is something which has already, I think, been used in the Russian market, is the question of a capital grant. You provide a grant towards the construction cost of the project. But that's fine, but I think there are two things that you have to watch out for from the public sector point of view. The first is not too much. If you provide let's say 60% of the cost of the project towards construction, it's you who are now taking the construction risk, not the private sector, because you've got more money in the project. And secondly, not too soon. If you start providing the money while construction is going on, again, you are taking the construction risk. The time to provide that money is after the construction is finished, which means, of course, that more money has to be raised by the private sector during the construction, but it will get paid off quickly after the end of construction. If you don't do that, again, you're taking back too much risk in the public sector. Mezzanine debt, which is debt that comes between the senior debt provided by lenders, such as banks, and debt that may be provided by shareholders, is a way of kind of filling a financing gap, and that can be found quite commonly. That would be provided by the public sector. Another approach is to partly construct the project. This has been used particularly in the rail sector, where the public sector will build the track and build the track, but the signaling and the stations and maybe the rolling stock are provided by the private sector. The problem about that is you get interface issues between the two. So each will blame the other if something goes wrong with the track. They'll say, oh, it wasn't really the track, it was the signaling, and the signaling people will blame the track, etc., etc. So there's an interface problem there, but it has been used. I mean, it's the way in which the Dutch, for example, built their first high-speed train. In relation to traffic, minimum revenue guarantee is really the ideal way forward. In other words, you're guaranteeing that at least there will be a certain level of traffic. The advantage of that is that if you achieve that level of traffic in the public sector, you're paying nothing. It's also the case that if you're more optimistic in the public sector than the private sector, you're more willing to give this minimum revenue guarantee because, of course, you believe you'll actually reach that level of traffic and you won't have to pay out under that guarantee. Equally, of course, the amount of the guarantee is much less than guaranteeing the debt. But if you're going to do that, it has to work both ways. If the traffic goes down, fine, below a certain level, fine, you pay something. And it's not necessarily 100% of the difference. You'll pay maybe 85% of the difference, and still 15% of that loss goes to the private sector to make sure the private sector still has an interest in trying to keep the revenue up. But it works the other way around too. If traffic is much higher than expected, well, that's not really because of the project company, because they didn't actually achieve this traffic. It was just because there's more traffic. So the same thing applies. You actually get a share of the surplus revenue as well. Any sort of guarantee of this work, this type, has to work both ways. But it's a very effective mechanism that's been very widely used in road concessions, and is really, in my view, the right way forward in road concessions. That perhaps than a combination of capital grants rather than things like debt guarantees. Another approach which has not been used widely, it's basically invented in Chile and hasn't been seen in many other countries, is an extension of the concession. So if the traffic is below what you expect, you actually extend the concession for a period of time to enable it to earn more money, and in that way for the investors and lenders to get paid back. The Chileans have what's called a net present value of revenues model, which in my view is a very interesting model, but it's not one that's met with favor in other countries. And then, of course, you have the availability PPP. The availability PPP retains the usage risk in the public sector, and of course, everything is being paid for by the public sector. But clearly, that raises public issues, budget issues, as far as the public sector is concerned. I think, as I understand it, the Moscow Central PPP, when I looked it up, was described as an availability model concession, which I found extremely confusing because, as far as I'm concerned, those are two different models. Comes back to the point I was making in the first place. But of course, it is possible to charge tolls on an availability PPP road, in which case the project company just collects the tolls, and it could pay the tolls over to the public authority, or it can just use the tolls to make the availability payment, and if there's a surplus, it just pays it to the public authority, or if there's a deficit, it just gets paid the deficit. So you can still toll an availability road. And it's interesting that in the United States, where they started off very much going for concessions for toll roads, they've very much now switched to availability roads, partly because of public oppositions to tolls. The question of risk transfer and what public sector security. Another thing which I kind of read running through the Russian legislation is a feeling on the public sector side this is not very secure from their point of view. They can't really be sure this is going to be properly built and properly looked after. And I think that arises from a degree of misapprehension of the way in which risk transfer should be working. Because the private sector is taking this risk of building on time and on budget and to specification, and what happens if they don't? Well, the private sector is going to lose money because they're going to have to pay out more for construction. They're going to lose money because it's completed late, etc., etc. So for the most part, there's plenty of incentive on the private sector to get it right. You can have a complete disaster, and we've had one or two of those in the UK, where the contractor gets it so badly wrong that the losses are really huge and the private sector just kind of gives up. But for the most part, that's not what happens. If there's a problem, the private sector steps in and solves the problem. And there's plenty of evidence to show that in other countries. If you structure it right, you don't need to worry about this in the public sector. The private sector will do the job for you. That's what you're paying them for. That's why you're paying them this extra money to take these risks. That's what risk transfer means. Similarly, the question of revenues, well, we talked about this. It says see next slide, but it's the previous slide. We've talked about that. Performance standards. Again, you can ensure the private sector performs by charging them penalties if they don't perform, by setting out a detailed penalty regime, which is an important part of the contract, as I've said previously. And similarly, this key issue of operation and maintenance costs. I mean, that's a very big risk for the public sector. You build something and you're taking this long-term risk of operation and maintenance, and you don't know what those costs are going to be. And the private sector, which in reality doesn't necessarily know much better than you do, but the fact is the private sector is taking these risks. So again, unless they get it really badly wrong and decide they're going to walk away and lose all their money, it means you're going to transfer a big risk to the private sector. I think that's a major factor in favor of PPPs. It is the existence of private capital that protects you. Because the private sector has so much money in the project, they have an incentive to sort it out. Because the alternative is, if they're going to lose all their money, the private sector has got 100 in this project, and it's going to cost 10 to sort it out. Well, they're going to spend 10 because otherwise they're going to lose 100. So that's the basic protection for the public sector. Plus this question of detailed survey before the end. Now, it's true that, and then also this question of complete failure of the project. If the project fails completely and is terminated, you need a regime within the contract and within the law, or if it appears in the law, that pays the right amount of money to the private sector. The right amount of money is they should be paid what the project is worth, not the debt, which is what appears in the present Russian concession law, I think, but what the project is worth. And that may well be less than the debt, depending on where the project has got to. So provided you get these things right from the public sector point of view, you are well protected. And experience in other countries, and you can talk to many other countries, will tell you that you are well protected. It's only if you don't follow the basics, if you don't deal with these risk transfer issues, if you use state banks to finance things instead of the private sector, et cetera, that things start going wrong. Yeah, and then finally, a few thoughts on, or almost finally, a few thoughts on PPPs. I mean, there's no question that the reason why governments go initially for PPPs is because it helps the public budget. There is an infrastructure deficit in virtually every country, and the only way of trying to deal with this deficit with any speed is to use PPPs. And of course, for the most part, if they're done right, these things are kind of off balance sheet for government. They're not showing up as government debt. I would say that within the European Union, which probably has the toughest rules about this, if more than 50% of the project is in any way supported by the government, and that means capital grants, debt guarantees, revenue guarantees, any way adds up to 50% of the cost of the project or 50% of the revenue, it becomes a public sector project and the debt goes on the public sector balance sheet. And in fact, there's a whole lot of series of sub-rules as well, which can trip you over into putting it onto the public sector budget. And I can tell you that, working on the government side here, we have to be awfully careful when we agree to any alteration in a PPP contract. It doesn't trip it to a public sector contract, because that's the last thing, or public sector debt rather, because that's the last thing we want. That undoubtedly is the main initial reason. But then if you think about economic development, what this allows you to do is to develop infrastructure more quickly, which itself produces faster economic development. So that from that point of view, there is an economic benefit in the project. Then the other thing it does is avoid cost overruns for the public sector. The public sector is not very good at managing construction contracts. The public sector tends to end up being late and with cost overruns. That doesn't or shouldn't happen in relation to PPPs. Then kind of linked to that is that on the whole, it's the private sector that's better at project management than the public sector. So again, PPPs bring that expertise. Then there comes the subject that I mentioned already, that you've got whole life costing of the project and you've got whole life maintenance of the project, something that you don't have in a public sector project. Now, it may well be said that, gosh, this is awfully complicated. These are very complicated contracts. The financing is very complicated. And yes, that's true. It is. But actually, if you were doing the job properly in the private sector, in the public sector anyway, even in the public sector, it would be complicated. It's not complicated in the public sector because the public sector tends to cut corners. The public sector doesn't really consider long-term maintenance or the long-term financial viability of a project in the same way. It's forced to do so in PPPs. And although I know I've seen this in various countries that government ministries don't want to do PPPs, it's too much hard work. They can just go to the Public Works Loans Department and just get them to build a building. But then the Public Works Loans Department doesn't have a budget, so the building never gets built. Or when the building is built, it's not built to a very good standard. Whereas the ones who went and got a PPP building built have a wonderful building and they're very happy with it. So, there are all kinds of reasons why, complication is not an answer necessarily not to do it. Project preparation, I'm going to come back to this in a second, but project preparation is very expensive because of all the extra things you have to do. And the other argument is, well, this is too expensive. Public finance is cheaper. Well, yes, it's clearly cheaper for the public sector to borrow money than for a project company to raise finance. But you're not comparing two equivalent things here. When the public sector raises finance, the people who are lending money to the public sector, people who buy government bonds, are not taking a risk on a project. They're simply taking a risk on the government. But the public sector is taking the risk on that project. So somewhere else in the public sector, that cost of that risk is being borne by somebody. You've got to add that together to get the real cost of public sector finance to build a project. And of course, what you do in a PPP is that it's already been added together. The two, this is why you're paying a higher cost. So you've got to be careful when you say public sector finance is cheaper. And I notice in the PPP law, the Russian PPP law, it has the concept of comparative advantage, which is trying to compare public and private sector financing. Problem with that is it's very difficult to do. I won't go into details, we haven't got time, but it's very difficult to do. And this whole sort of winners, yeah, okay. Yeah. And then the other factor is simply, it's really a political thing. Why should the private sector make a profit out of public service? And the answer to that is the private sector does that all the time. If the government is building a new road, it will engage a private sector construction contractor to build the road. So what's the difference, really? This undoubtedly is where a lot of the political opposition, which does exist in many countries, including Britain, to PPPs comes from. The idea that somehow the private sector is making a profit out of something that should be a public service. So, just to conclude before some questions, why do, whoops, going too many places there. Yeah, why do projects fail? Triggers for failure. The most common reason actually is simply the inability to raise the finance, because financing has not been properly taken into account when the project was being prepared by the public sector. The public sector kind of just assumes financing is going to, private sector finance is going to fall out of the sky. It doesn't work like that. The public sector has got to understand what the private sector requires, the terms on which the private sector is going to provide that finance. Of course, it's going to use advisors to do that, financial advisors, amongst others, so that when the time comes, it will not be a surprise. But the trouble is that what the public sector tends to do is to rush ahead, sign a concession with no finance, and then surprise, surprise, it's not financeable. The private sector doesn't want to finance it. And then you're in a mess. It means that, for example, you've got to start renegotiating the concession, or it's going to cost a lot more than you think, or whatever. So actually, the financing should be signed on the same day, at the same time, in the same place as the PPP contract itself, not separately. Should all be signed together. Now I know that can't always happen, but it should happen most of the time, and a lot of the time when it doesn't happen, as I say, you're in trouble. Then underestimation of construction costs. What happens is the public sector goes out for bids, and it's had estimates of the construction costs and it's underestimated them. Unfortunately, that happens a lot. And then the public sector has got to decide, well, the project is now a lot more expensive because the construction costs have gone up. What am I going to do? Am I going to start again, get some different project, agree to pay more, try and cut down the scope of this project? You've got some difficult decisions to make at that point in the public sector. And then you've got really the sort of the whole winner's curse thing, as I mentioned, where people have underestimated costs. Going back, I guess, quite a few years now, I think. One Christmas, when I was working on the public sector side of the table, I got a phone call and somebody said, "Look, can you go to this meeting at the Inland Revenue, with the sort of the tax office in the UK, who had a PPP in relation to their buildings? The project company wants to come in. I don't know what they want to talk about." And this was 6 months after the bid, the contract had been signed. And they came in and made a presentation and said basically they'd made mistakes in their bid and it was quite impossible for them to continue. And if some change wasn't made, they would just have to go bankrupt. And the meeting came to an end. They left. I sat back and said, well, okay, it looks like the private sector's got a problem here. They're going to go bankrupt. Because all it means for the public sector is that somebody else takes over the contract, doesn't affect the price of the contract, and it affects what the private sector gets paid. The previous private sector party gets paid for the contract, which is obviously not very much. So as far as I was concerned, that was fine. Interestingly, the reaction of the civil servants around the table was a common one, which was, oh, no, because this would affect our reputation if the project has gone wrong in this way. And so they actually ended up renegotiating the deal, which was completely the wrong thing to do. And the other thing was that there were two bids in the end for this project. The bid that won was much cheaper than the other bid. Why? No, the public sector should have sat down and said, why is this bid so much cheaper? These other people are very experienced people. Why is this bidder so much cheaper? Have they made a mistake somewhere? Because as you can see, accepting the cheapest bid isn't necessarily the right thing to do, because if the cheapest bid is going to fall over 6 months later, it doesn't make sense to accept the cheapest bid. So this, of course, comes back also to your procurement legislation, which again is an issue, of course, I think in the Russian law. I haven't looked at that in detail, but I noticed some quite detailed rules which may or may not work in this kind of context. So those are, and a kind of link to that is investors themselves without the experience to understand what they're taking on. So they come in with a cheap bid because they don't actually understand what they're doing. So there's a kind of variety of reasons there why projects fail. So there we are. There's some very quick thoughts. I will leave you with the key, if I can get the slide. You're missing that. Oh, there we go. The key final piece of advice, which is the best advice I can give you, and I'll leave you to read the advice. Thank you. But I'll be happy to answer some questions.
Okay, Mr. Yescombe, thank you first of all for this brilliant speech. And actually, I have two questions. First, you mentioned that upon the termination of the project, or the PPP, the public party should compensate based on the worth of the project, not on the amount of outstanding debt. This is definitely not the case in Russia.
I know.
Perhaps you can mention the jurisdictions or the projects where that was the actual contractual provision. This is
everywhere except Russia, I think.
Yeah, certainly except Russia.
Yeah, sorry?
Yeah, except Russia, where this is the actual case.
Nowhere.
Nowhere.
That I know of, nowhere.
Oh. Well, thank you. And the second question, perhaps I will be out.
Just to be clear, it works both ways. The worth of the project may be more or less than the debt. Now, if the worth of the project is more than the debt, then obviously in Russia you're getting a bargain. But at the same time, the private sector is, you're defrauding the private sector. But of course, if it's worth less than the debt, you're paying too much. I mean, that's why there needs to be a connection between the payment and the value of the project. The debt has nothing to do with the value of the project.
Well, at least you don't need to measure.
Yeah, well, I can tell you a bit about measurement, but yes, you're right, yes.
And the second question, perhaps I will bring you out of the scope of your today's topic, because you were basically focused on pure non-recourse project finance. But if we can get sidestep to the limited recourse project finance. I remember like 5-6 years ago, we were doing the limited recourse project finance deals, purely private. And we were using such like vehicles as various sponsor support agreements, debt service agreements, limited conditional guarantees, and so on and so forth. And it was all counted by the auditors as the measures of limited recourse without direct influence on the originator's balance sheet. But while the time was passing, now I'm looking at all these measures counted as the full recourse. So what else is left? Perhaps except of take-or-pay contracts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true to say that the trend, both in the public and the private sector, is that more and more contingent risk has come on balance sheets, so it makes it more and more difficult. I mean, you still see sponsor support in some sectors, for example, in oil refinery projects, because in oil refinery projects, you will never get a turnkey contract because because the technology for the oil refinery is owned by very few people. There are only very few technologies, and these people don't enter into turnkey contracts. So you will tend to see, therefore, the big oil companies as sponsors will then give a completion guarantee because they have to, because that's the only way. Or indeed, they'll just build the refinery themselves and then refinance it with project finance. But I'm not aware of, let's say, any very magic tricks that enable sponsors to give huge amounts of guarantees and still keep these guarantees off their balance sheet. I think it's somewhat easy. I mean, this is the mirror image of what we were talking about with the public sector. It's the same kind of thing. The public sector is giving guarantees that do, to a certain extent, enable it to stay off balance sheet if the guarantees are done right, and also depending on how the national accounting system actually works.
Public sector doesn't have a contractual covenants.
Yeah, it does. Well, but the public sector does. You know, the public sector has signed something with the IMF, or its debt is being monitored, etc. So actually, it has contractual covenants too. Let me just revert briefly to this question of worth of the project, because I think that's actually quite an important point. How is it done elsewhere? The simplest method, which is kind of implied also in the Russian legislation, but again, it's not very clear how it works, is that you auction the contract. And whatever somebody bids for the contract is what the previous contractor actually gets, because that's what it's worth to a new person. Now, that is something that was introduced in the British system, and they were the first to do it in the 1990s, in fact. However, I should say that, to my knowledge, an auction of a contract has never taken place. Why? Because if there's a default, it never happens that the project company says, yeah, you know, you're right. I'm in default. You're quite right. It never happens like that. No. I mean, you know, it was because you did this, and he did that, and that, you know, it's not really a default. And I'll see you in court. And then you spend months and months and months and months and months arguing, and eventually you reach a settlement. And that's it. You never have an auction. The threat of an auction is quite a good way of reaching a settlement, however. If the threat of the auction is credible, it's quite a good way of reaching a settlement. So that's one way. The other way is a valuation of the project. Now, there are various ways of doing this, but and there are defects in all of them, but one way is that you take the financial model again, you project the future cash flow, you discount it to today's value, and again, you've got to think about what discount rate you do. You then say, okay, why is the project going wrong? Is it because operating costs are high? Well, in which case I'll put up the operating costs. Or is it because I need to spend some more money on the asset? So I'll have to invest some more money. You take that all into account in the project, and you reduce the value, and then you pay that reduced value to the contractor. There's a lot of defects which I haven't got time to go into in that method, but it's really the only other method other than an auction. It's the only other method. So, but it's what it's trying to do is again to be fair to both sides. The public sector should pay only what the project is worth, and the private sector should only be paid what the project is worth. So, yeah, that's why you do that. Okay?
Thank you.
Yes. Okay, talking about waste management facilities construction, sorting plants, and landfill sites. Could you please explain in more detail how it is regulated in the UK? Is it availability principle that works, or concession model? Because in Russia we have concession model, user pay principle, and the private partner gets the income through tariff. You know what it means? Yes, and sometimes it is not a profitable project, because in Russia the revenue from the sale of recyclables can deduct the sum of tariff. So I think there is no other country in which it works that way. It was the first question, and the second is, are you aware of any legal disputes or judicial practice related to the direct agreement? Or because in Russia there is none.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll deal quickly with the second question first. The direct agreement that you have in Russia, as I understand it, is the one that, amongst other things, provides the guarantee, which is its main reason, I think. Whereas the direct agreement in other countries is an agreement that basically says, suppose the contractor has defaulted, the lenders are given some more time on top of the time the contractor has to try and sort out the problem. Why does the public sector do this? Because the main concern of the public sector is the continuance of the public service. So if the lenders are willing to try and settle this without making too much, without too much mess, then it's better to give the lenders a bit more time to come in and sort it out. De facto, again, this agreement is seldom actually used. The public sector will just say, yeah, okay, fine, I'll just give you some time, never mind what the agreement says, because I'm concerned, if I'm convinced that you are doing the right thing, you, the private sector, are doing the right thing, I'll just give you all the time you need. I don't need to worry about what the agreement says. I'm not going to stop after 6 months. If it takes 7 months, fine, because in the meantime, the private sector is losing money, so there's plenty of incentive. So I'm not aware of any litigation on direct agreements of that type, because there's been no real reason to litigate. Does that answer that question? Or?
In Russia, we have a direct agreement that is concluded between 3 parties. It's private partner, public partner, and lenders, banks.
Yeah.
And the banks usually have a right to interfere into the project and...
No, okay, the banks don't have any right to interfere in the direct agreement. The only thing that the direct agreement, I didn't know that. Another interesting aspect of Russian project finance, I think. But the only thing that the banks can do under the sort of direct agreement I'm talking about is they get more time to deal with the default. That's the only thing they can do. They have no other rights. In
Russia, they can take part in selecting a new private partner, and
okay. Well, in effect, the direct agreement gives them. That is a further point, actually. The direct agreement also gives them the right to select the private partner, not even take part. It actually gives them the right to select the private partner. Why? Because they have the money at risk anyway. So they're going to want to select the best person. So actually, the direct agreement avoids the kind of auction that I've mentioned, because they can go ahead and actually select the private partner. So to come back to your question on waste, now this is a complicated subject, but in summary, to take one step backwards. In Britain, we were very far behind the rest of Europe in terms of landfilling waste. We were landfilling a lot of our waste. European Union rules came in, which again will still be obeying even if and when we ever leave, which required us to stop landfilling because it creates methane gas and it's bad for the environment. So there was a very big program initially of PPPs, procuring various different types of waste processing. I mean, obviously incinerators, but also things like mechanical and biological treatment, anaerobic digestion, and other similar types of technology. And these were done on a PPP basis. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, because it's not quite the same as what we've been talking about previously. But secondly, we have operating a large part of the waste collection market, as well as waste processing market, is actually operated by the private sector in the UK. So we have large private sector companies, particularly the French companies, Veolia and Suez, who are the big players in this field, who themselves operate incinerators. Because a large proportion of the waste in the UK, municipal waste, is dealt with by PPPs, but a large part of the waste comes from what we call the commercial and industrial sector, which means basically offices, factories, and so forth. And municipalities have no obligation to collect this waste. They have to dispose of that waste themselves. So they go to the private sector to dispose of that waste. The situation here may be different. So you've got private sector operations going on as well, and to a certain extent in competition with PPPs, because obviously an incinerator is an incinerator, and a municipality can sign a contract to deliver its waste to a private sector PPP, and they do sign contracts to deliver to private sector to private sector projects, not PPPs. The reason they would enter into a PPP is because they want to own the incinerator at the end of the contract, or they own the land and they don't want to lose that land for waste processing, because another problem in Britain is it's very difficult to get planning permission to build incinerators, because nobody wants an incinerator near their house. So if you have planning permission to build an incinerator, this is very, very precious and you don't want to lose it. How are the contracts arranged? I mean, first of all, you're right, recyclables doesn't in any way, especially now, because you can't send it to China anymore. It doesn't in any way cover the costs. The main source of third-party income, as we call it in the UK, TPI, is electricity generation. Electricity generation covers about a quarter to a third of the costs, typically. The rest has to be covered basically by the municipality or the people who are collecting the waste. How do they pay for this? There are two basic methods. One is that because the question is, if you're a municipality, you're going to sign a 30-year contract. How do you know how much waste you're going to have over 30 years? And how do you know the composition of this waste over 30 years? Because you're going to change to recycling this and that, and take the plastic out, and it makes the calorific value is worse, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you deal with this? Well, there are a series of ways. First of all, the contract may be signed on the basis that it simply takes all the waste being generated by the municipality, provided it is within a certain calorific range. So what that means is that the private sector is taking the risk of the quantity of waste being produced by the public sector. But that's okay, because if the incinerator is not full, they know they can get waste from elsewhere, because you've got this commercial and industrial market. So they can get waste from other places. So they're not worried if in the end the projections are too low. Equally, there has to be flexibility the other way if the projections are too high, because you're going to start off, ideally, you don't want the incinerator to be completely full, because this means if the waste increases, what are you going to do? So you've got to start off where the incinerator is maybe 90% full, and is taking 10% from somewhere else. And then gradually this 10% is filled up. So that's one way of doing it. The other way is simply the municipality has a right for so many tons of capacity. and it is taking the risk that it needs more capacity. So there are two different contractual types there. But at the same time, you've got this question of calorific value. Clearly, if the calorific value starts to fall outside the range, there has to be some kind of adjustment. Either some waste is going to be found from somewhere else to adjust this waste, or you're going to actually end up with a less efficient incinerator in terms of, say, electricity generation. So you have to, this is like a change, as I was talking earlier, a change. There has to be compensation for this within the system. And this doesn't even take into account all the complexities of running mechanical and biological treatment plant where you're pre-treating the waste, which has all sorts of complications by itself, which I don't think I should, it's probably too technical for this audience anyway, I think. I don't know, does that basically answer the questions you had? I may say that elsewhere in Western Europe, PPPs for waste are relatively unusual. In general, it's municipalities who are doing it. Countries like Germany, it's generally municipalities who are doing the incinerators, not the PPPs. Okay, how are we doing? Some time. I think we'll be room for one more question if we have one.
Excuse me, I have one little question. Talking about incineration plants and mechanical and sorting and so forth, as I understood, in the UK, only incineration plants can be built through PPP contract.
No.
All the plants.
Mechanical, biological treatment, anaerobic digestion, all of them. This is one reason why I'm still employed by the British government, because we've had so many problems with the non-incineration plant basically not working well.
In Russia, all municipal waste is going to used in the plants that are operated by the PPP projects. Mm-hmm. And so the situation kind of different.
Well, in effect, no, I think it is actually similar. In other words, this additional processing, for example, drying and composting, these additional kind of processes are being provided under PPPs. The problem is that the equipment that is being used for doing it is failing a lot of the time. And one of the reasons it's failing is that the bidding for these projects was very competitive. So the people who were bidding were pushing up the performance of, like mechanical and biological plant, actually beyond what the manufacturer could really do. So we've ended up with some quite large terminations, more or less defaults of projects, precisely because the plant has not been able to perform in this way. And without that performance, there's no point having the plant. So in fact, increasingly what's happening now is that this sort of plant is not even being used. The waste is simply being just torn up, ready for the incinerator and put in an incinerator. Pre-processing is starting to disappear because the idea of recycling is not working because you can't sell it. Food waste, there is a push by the government to actually deal separately in anaerobic digestion through food waste. But other types of, and obviously you can pre-process and take out metals and this kind of thing. But otherwise, other types of, you've either got to go to much more expensive recycling where you've got to have separate collection of paper and this kind of thing, or you just burn everything. I mean, in my view, the most ecologically best thing to do is you build a really big incinerator and you burn everything, because that is ecologically the best thing to do, but nobody believes that. So.
Мой вопрос в связи с тем, что вы упомянули о ситуации в России, и вы слукавили, вы достаточно хорошо разбираетесь с той ситуацией, которой мы сейчас располагаем, и в отношении, в том числе, инвесторов и иностранных инвесторов в том числе. И основная проблема сейчас, которую мы имеем на рынке, то, что инвесторы не идут в проекты, она связана именно с тем, что таковых проектов нет, сложные финансовые условия и те гарантии государства, которые они могут нам предоставить. Нет проектов, сложные финансовые условия на рынке и гарантии со стороны государства.
Okay, you have competition now.
В связи с этим наш Минфин тоже это понимает, но, к сожалению, он не читал вашу книгу. И вот буквально на днях мы все изучаем сейчас активно проект, который они нам предложили, нового инвесткодекса, где, с одной стороны, предоставляются разные преференции для инвесторов, о которых вы говорили, они в чем-то похожи. Но чтобы получить эти преференции, нужно будет пройти достаточно большие круги. То есть у нас ужесточили путь дохождения до подписания контракта, у нас утяжелили условия, будут заставлять делать дополнительный финансовый аудит. То есть это не просто изучение финмодели, а несколько этапов этого изучения. Но я вас не буду просить оценивать то, что нам предлагает сделать Минфин. У меня вопрос в другом. Как вы думаете, в нашей ситуации, что бы вы предложили первичные шаги, если вам как бы кажется, что это немножко некорректно, но представим, что мы говорим о Бразилии. Как вы думаете, все-таки, вот какие первичные шаги сейчас лучше сделать нашему правительству, чтобы инвесторы вернулись на рынок? Спасибо.
Right. Well, actually, I think there's a lot of parallels between Brazil and Russia anyway, actually. I mean, particularly the fundamental thing, this is a very difficult subject for people in the public sector to deal with because it's so far away from what they're used to doing, as I said earlier on. So the primary challenge, and this is a challenge for the private sector too, is one of education, and education, and one of the ways in which education can be gathered is simply by international exchange. I mean, there are PPP units, just as there is one, I think, in the Ministry of Finance. There are PPP units all over the world, and they all talk to each other, and they all learn from each other. So I think it's a matter of firstly trying to persuade the Ministry of Finance to learn from other sources what is the normal international practice in relation to PPPs? Because, I mean, it is evident, again, without wishing to be rude, it is evident that the Russian practice is not really fitting in to what one sees in most parts of the world. So this sort of education side is I think, very important. My impression is that that there's actually a pretty well-educated private sector in many respects who know what has to be done, but they can't do it because the system isn't allowing them to do it. Now that's actually quite unusual. Usually, in a situation where many PPPs haven't been done, the private sector doesn't know how to do it either. I mean, you can get around that obviously because there are international investors, but I mean within Russia probably there are enough people to do that. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that kind of is a solution to your question. I'm not sure it is a solution, but I think it is a matter of trying to communicate with people in the public sector to help them understand. Not just one of the issues you've not just got to pass a PPP law. You've got to make sure it fits with all the other laws. So if you have an investment law which is not consistent or a procurement law which is not consistent, you're going to end up in a mess. So these laws have got to fit together. And that's another challenge for the public sector. It's not just a matter of passing a concession law. You've got to make sure all the other laws fit together. I mean, I didn't mention this issue of tariffs. It's not clear to me looking at the Russian law, just who is setting the tariffs. Are they being set by the contract or are they being set by the state?
Специальный орган устанавливает. Да, у нас регулируемые тарифы, они не могут повышаться до определенного предела, есть определенные ограничения. В принципе, в любой сфере.
Yeah, but you see, that doesn't work for PPPs. The tariff should be set in the contract with the PPPs because it gives certainty. It should be a reasonable tariff, and the way of increasing it should also be reasonable. But a regulated tariff leaves investors completely exposed as to what the tariff is going to be. So I don't think that works very well. I mean, it's something I would say the British government is actively looking at exactly that model because the PPP model has fallen out of favor and they're trying to find another model. I don't believe that they're going to find a solution.
Спасибо, очень корректно.
Okay. I think we probably have come to the. Yeah, I think we've come to the end, I'm afraid. So thank you all very much for your attention. Thank you for coming, and I hope you found it interesting.